Well, welcome everybody. My name's Tom Caldwell. I'm the CTO of Techniche, probably a company you've never heard of, but Techniche, we're a software company, we're global, and we come out of the fuel retail industry and helped a lot of very large fuel retail customers do the repair and maintenance of their fuel forecourts. Right? And so now the big oil companies are all going into big energy, so they're taking us with us. So we have a number of charge point operators that use our software. In fact, personally, I'm sort of sitting there every day and watching that happen. So I'm getting to know the EV charging infrastructure really well. So today what I want to do is, it's RSA. And, my legacy, I come from Microsoft and Cisco. I've had security products. I've been here speaking at RSA before. I have sort of a passion about botnets and swarming and things like that. But today I want to talk about the cybersecurity of EV charging. But I'm also going to sort of talk about EV chargers in general because not a lot of people know about them and understand them. So hopefully you'll find this interesting today. So let's get started. Little disclaimer thing. So how many people actually drive an EV automobile? Oh, a good percentage. And then, do you own an EV charger at your house? Yeah, so, okay. And then, obviously, there's public chargers everywhere. Have people been using them, or because you have a charger at your house, you don't need to? But, so I'm going to talk about all these areas, whether they're home chargers or public chargers, and talk about some of the security vulnerabilities. Now, they are, in essence, a smart IoT device. So if you sort of going, okay, sort of interested in chargers, it's going to be the same cybersecurity we've been talking about for years now on protecting IoT. And so they're distributed. The public ones are out where they can get issues with physical security. So let's talk about that. You see my sort of botnets up in the corner. I have to include them around. So chargers are growing significantly, right? They're all over the place. They're going in stores and gyms and parking lots, parking structures. In fact, you can't build a building nowadays or a business park without having EV chargers, right? And so the graphs are all just saying there's an explosive growth of them. And that's because the EV automobiles are exploding, right? In fact, I just read an article yesterday about how California has surpassed selling 1.5 million EV autos, and they're 2 years ahead of schedule. So this thing's moving, it's moving fast, it's funded by governments, and there's some trends that are happening, right? So one, there's EV chargers that are going in, and so they're up 40% from 2021. In fact, it's funny, this presentation was due back in February because RSA has a whole program around speaking and getting your presentations, approved. But all these statistics that we're looking at, they've all changed. They've increased, all these statistics since I actually first presented this presentation in February. So it's moving fast. But, at Super Bowl, we found the first EV advertisement. And, there's a lot of different charging points that are being installed. So I think you get it. Now, one thing is on the charger doesn't tell the car how much electricity it's going to feed. The car actually tells the charger how much energy they need. So the car is sort of in control of this whole charging experience. And so I started looking, well, if you're going to do cybersecurity of this, you got to sort of look at the automobile and see what vulnerabilities you have with that, right? So this group took about 900 incidents and they analyzed that. Now, 56.9% were black hat. But if you look, and I'm sure you can't see all the writing on the bottom of the chart, but the longest pole in the tent was 42.1 or 41.1% were attacks on the external servers up in the cloud. So that was the number one attack. And you think, oh, there's a mobile app. So you'd think, okay, then that should be a vulnerability and under attack, and it is only 7.3% of the time. And you'll also notice that, oops, go back a little bit, the remote attacks, there we go, 84.5% of these attacks on the automobile were remote, right? So there's a whole group that's studying the automobile and its vulnerabilities, because once you get them connected, that's another way into the charger. And lithium batteries, they're about 20% harder to put out than like a fuel automobile that's on fire. So, and then once they catch fire, sometimes the only way to put them out is dig a big hole and fill it full of water and push the car into it. So these lithium fires are becoming a very touchy subject. And so that'll come up over and over again. But can the charger overfeed the car with so much energy that it could cause it to catch on fire? Hasn't yet, because there's all these safeguards, but it concerns a lot of people, these fires. Oops. So let's just start unwinding the electrical vehicle chargers, right? So there's all types. There's fast chargers, slow chargers, home chargers. There's some very sophisticated fast chargers that are out there, very smart. There's some very dumb home chargers. There's even home-built kits for chargers. So we've got to, just like IoT, if you're a cybersecurity expert, you need to sort of tear apart how it's constructed, what are the components, and to start understanding what are the vulnerabilities. And then, I talked about how smart are the chargers, but really it's the automobile that's telling the charger. In fact, the other day I was watching an interaction, because I can watch it remotely through my software, and I saw that the automobile told the charger, pause, just stop sending me the charge. I'm not unconnected. The car, for some reason, thought it was getting either overheated, or for some reason, it just told the charger, pause. And it waited a little while, and then it told the charger, okay, keep giving me electricity. So there's a whole protocol and connectivity between the auto and the charger. And again, this starts playing into that when you're a hacker trying to figure out, okay, where's the entry point? How do I get in? Oops, press the right button. The other part is whether it's a POS system in a public charger and it's going to take a credit card, or whether it's a loyalty program. Now, most of them are all moving towards the loyalty program, because just swiping credit cards at a charger is dangerous enough and open season for hackers. So pretty much you're going to find loyalty programs where you put in your card in the cloud. And then I'll talk a little bit about vandalism and fire hazards. In fact, 2 EV autos were sitting in Florida, and they were underwater, right, because of the flooding. And they caught on fire just from the flooding. So there is sensitivity, again, back to that fire. Now, cybersecurity hacks in the news. There was the one with all the Russian chargers where they took it over and then put a message on the screens, right? The reason I bring this up is because it was actually the manufacturer that did this. And they had a back door. In fact, most of these chargers have a manufacturer back door. And so if they can get in, so can a hacker, right? So it's very interesting. The other Isle of Wight, might be right, but they took over and started putting porn on the chargers, right? And so the only way they could fix it was replace the charger, so get a new charger. They couldn't upgrade them there or anything like that. So they are being hacked. It's not in great numbers from what I can read, but you'll see how vulnerable they are just as I go through the next slides. Also, there's too many out-of-service chargers. So we operate in the UK, in Europe, in the US, globally, Australia. And so there's countries in Europe where half the chargers are down at any one time. I mean, 50% reliability. In the US, we average about 70% uptime, 30% downtime. But that's still unacceptable, right? You don't want, a third of your chargers down, right, or unavailable. It's just a bad user experience. And why do they go down? So one is software, right? Or four is software up top, but they have firmware, they need to be updated. In fact, they're so vulnerable nowadays, a hacker can get in 10 minutes and then download the source code, modify it, and upload it again to the charger. And that's happening. The other is connectivity. Are they sort of like ATM machines with a cellular LTE connection? Another one is equipment failure, and then vandalism is a big part of this, especially in certain areas of the city or certain areas where people just mess with the chargers. A lot of it's stealing cables or just tampering with them. Now, I'm going to focus on home EV chargers for a minute, and hopefully not scare too many people. But a lot of vendors are just going to China. They get the components, they assemble them together and put it in a wall box, and go, here, I'm selling a home charger. Now, they don't need a POS system or a loyalty program. You just have it in your garage, and it's simple. It charges your car. But the one thing it can do is you can catch your house on fire. And so you think I'm joking, but this is proven. I'll get some more statements about that. But a lot has to do with, did you wire your home properly to put in a charger, right? And are you running the washer and dryer at the same time you're trying to charge your car? You can overload the wiring wherever a charger is, but homes tend to be a little more susceptible because maybe you didn't put in the right wiring or you went cheap or something like that. So it is possible, and they've shown it, that hackers can get into a home charger network and then just digitally cause the charger to send too much electricity to the automobile. And I've even heard of autos catching on fire from this event. So Kaspersky, So they took apart a charge point charger and sort of analyzed it from a security point of view, right? And so obviously you got a mobile app there. That's an entry point. You've got Bluetooth. That's always sort of a bad idea and a vulnerability in itself. You got Wi-Fi. People can actually get into the Wi-Fi through the charger and then get into the home network or the restaurant network or the grocery store network, depending on where they're hooked up to, if the networks are connected, right? But again, what Kaspersky found is open telnet port, right? And then the username and passwords, they're like sort of the routers when you buy them at your home and you don't change the password. It's the same thing with chargers. They have a telnet port. You don't change the passwords. It's easy to get in. You're just welcoming, a hacker. And then the other is a house fire due to overheating of the wires. So I sort of talked about that, but Kaspersky went through it and actually tried it out in a controlled setting and was able to do that. And then there's other vulnerabilities in the Bluetooth stack, and so there's a lot of different ways to attack these things, and they're not very secure at this point. Now, the pen test partners, they went and analyzed these chargers from EO. There's about 4,000 of them across the UK. And so they found out within 10 minutes, they were able to get the source code out of the device. They were able to get the network topology because there was hardened strings inside the charger that they were found. FTP was turned on. They got the credentials for that. These chargers send emails, so SMTP was open, and they got the credentials for that. And then all the encryption and decryption keys, all within 10 minutes. So they figured, well, gee, we could create a botnet, they didn't do it, that could actually go out and take all the chargers into a botnet and then control them, do command and control on them, just like a typical botnet does. The other part of this is I found in studying chargers that there's more back-end systems involved, and it's all about the data, right? You're after the data. So, but you do have the mobile apps, you have the automobile I've talked about, the charger itself. It may be connected up to a building system, and then there's the grid, which I'll touch on in a few slides. And then you have all these back-end systems. You have a charge point monitoring system that uses this protocol OCPP to monitor the chargers. You have a system like ours that does the repair and maintenance management of the chargers. So there's a lot of back-end systems that have the inventory, they have the data, monitoring data, maybe warranty data. There's a lot of data that could be exposed. So again, you need integration and automation, but again, cybersecurity, risk protection, pen testing, all the best practices for these back-end systems. Now, when you start looking at the attack surface, you go, well, why are the chargers connected to the network? Well, it could be for the POS system, for remote monitoring through this OCPP protocol. It could, you could have smart signage, which they're putting next to chargers, because as you're charging, there's dwell time, right? So you can capture people's attention, market to them, sell them coffee, things like that. And then how are the chargers connected to a network? A lot of them just have the cellular LTE, 4G, 5G connection, sort of like ATM machines. Some of them have Wi-Fi, Ethernet, LAN. If you got 13, 15 chargers, I know there's hubs with like 30 chargers in one place, then you're gonna have them connected to a network, and then you've got the whole network security to worry about. And then they usually have one router that goes off into a telecommunications network somehow. And then again, they found if you have all these open services, FTP, Telnet, manufacturer backdoors, RFID, or the vehicle to charge connection, those are all, if you're a cybersecurity expert, you need to be concerned with all of these. And again, harden the thing, right? Turn all these services off. And then it is easy to send firmware updates. I mean, just think of it. You're managing, 500, 1,000, 5,000 chargers. And just like typical cybersecurity, you got to keep the software up to date, right? So you need to make it easy to push out software updates. Last thing you want to do is have to drive to every site and actually upgrade the software. That's the last thing you want to do. This slide is around people are measuring the impact and the costs around some of these cyber threats in EV charging. So I'll let you sort of dive into this if you decide to download my slides. The power grid, now what they're looking at is, some of these fast chargers, they're over like 350 kilowatt, right? So if you get enough of these, now they said there's not enough today to cause a grid problem, but they said, let's say you have 500 fast chargers in a region or 1,000, and you take a botnet, you take them over, and then all at the same time you shut them off. And so you could actually create an instability in our power grid by doing that. And there's this oscillating attack method. So we've got experts in the power grid looking at, okay, what are all the possibilities that somebody could disrupt the power grid by controlling a mass amount of chargers, right? So that's one thing to think about. There's also these things called charge point management systems. They're now being called CSMS, I think, forget what the other S is, but anyway, it's changing acronyms because this is a young, emerging industry. So terminology is changing, which is good. It's evolving, right? And so the SafeFlow in Israel, they're looking at the CPMS, and you can actually fake a charger and then being able to authenticate to that charge point management system and then use that to sort of get in and attack. And they've been studying this over in Israel and finding a lot of different vulnerabilities that way. And they've been publishing some of their stuff. And then this OCPP protocol, it's at 1.6, doesn't use encryption, doesn't have proper authentication. So it's sort of ancient. Ancient means, they really need to adopt some of the latest cyber protocols, right? So there's a 2.01 that's out there, hardly deployed, has some better security around it, but it's still got a ways to go. Now the government's getting involved, the US government, and so the Department of Transportation, there's a group called NEVI, and they're the ones who are helping distribute, the Biden funds got distributed to the states, which each state now gets to hand out all that money to go deploy chargers, right? So I read through their 90-page first published document around, I guess you'd call it best practices. But like one, they say, we want these chargers that we're paying for funding to be up 97% of the time. Well, we're not even close to that. We're like 70%. So how are they going to figure out how do you get an EV charger reliability up to 97+%, right? So that's a problem. But they're trying to put in cybersecurity in this document, and I have to say, I'm going to pat them on the back for a weak attempt, but NIST is starting to get involved, and they're starting to bring in experts, so I expect their documentation around the requirements to get this funding is going to be upscaled, but it's not happening as quick as it should. There's a plug and charge at the bottom, which is becoming in the standards. Yeah, so that's supposed to upgrade the security around loyalty programs, POS systems. Maybe we should have the data encrypted. Gee, novel idea, right? And so they're working on protocols, both ISO and OCPP, and it's coming along, but it's still not there. And then you got to go implement chargers that follow those protocols. So it's going to take, hopefully not a few years, but it could, as this starts getting implemented. So applying best practices to securing EV chargers, there's smart IoT devices. They're distributed. So there's a lot of, IoT best practices that are out there. And there's a lot of pen testers and cyber, service providers that can help you do that. There's best practices out there, the Sandia National Labs best practices paper. They have that about protecting EV charging infrastructure. And then again, just secure, harden, pen test, do everything that we've been doing for all the other IoT industries. And I think you'll be, protected, and just use common sense. So, a few last slides here. What does the future hold? So, my personal interest is in AI. I've had a AI startup, cybersecurity startup before I joined Techniche. And so I think there's a lot that's going to happen across the board. In fact, that's why I'm here in learning mode at RSA this year, is to learn about AI and, yes, ChatGPT, and how are people using it, what's the hype, and what's really working. So I'm very interested in applying this to our work in Techniche against the monitoring, repair, management, maintenance of EV chargers. So with that, I appreciate you listening today. If you have any questions, let me know. Yeah.
Earlier you mentioned some of these hacked chargers that was included, like sometimes you replace the actual charger, whereas we're also saying it's easy to upgrade the firmware.
Yeah, so they're all over the map. There's cheap chargers that you can buy, and the components are just old, and it's hard to upgrade them. And then like ABB and Tritium, and they're sort of the high-end chargers, and they're putting more effort, and you can upgrade them, and they have more components you can swap out and things like that. So, but it's such an emerging young market. It's all over the map on, if you're going to buy a charger, look at, it's sort of like cars. You can buy a cheap one, or you can buy the Mercedes. So they're all over the map. Yeah. Yeah.
Hi there. You mentioned before about these EV chargers having like loyalty programs where the card information is taken from some cloud, or to avoid the credit card being used for hacks. How is that what is it about the EV chargers that makes them more vulnerable to that in comparison to a gas station where I can take out my credit card or my debit card and use it on the station at the gas station, or use it on the pump at the gas station in order to pay for my gas? So why is EV charging, or why are these EV chargers worse off than the gas chargers for credit card use?
Yeah, usually, in Europe it's different, but like in the forecourt for pump fueling, there's an attendant usually, a store manager or somebody there watching. In the EV charger world, what they're finding is they're breaking into the cabinet and then putting RFID scanning hardware in the cabinets next to the POS system. That part I'm not a super expert on, but I've been reading about that's sort of a common thing because chargers are out in the wild and no one's watching them, and the cabinets are easy to break into. Yeah.
Hi. What kind of risks do you see to in-vehicle networks, like automotive Ethernet here? I know you mentioned that the vehicles usually issue the commands. Are the vehicles expecting complex responses back that could be compromised?
That one, you're a little bit out of my area with the automobile. I know there's protocols they're working on. Tesla, was sort of the first, and they have a very smart interconnection with their chargers and how much to charge, and they take into account the battery and making sure they don't overcharge the battery, and it's about battery health and longevity. However, I don't know all the new EV vehicles and what the standards are that they need to support to make this a smarter connection, but I know that's moving very quickly in the industry. I haven't heard any hackers using that to get into the auto or get into the charger yet, but I'm sort of keeping an eye on that one just as a professional. Yeah.
Question for you. In regards to public charging stations, I see them at Walmart, hotels, etc. Has there been any establishment on when these public charging stations get exploited, where the vulnerability lies with the host being Walmart, Marriott, or the business that's got the EV charging station, or the supplier of the EV charging station themselves, or both?
From what I understand, like the Walmarts, and in fact, a lot of those are our customers and such, they're outsourcing EV charging because nobody really knows about EV charging. They don't have any experts in-house, so why not just outsource to a charge point operator, and they're soup to nuts. They install them, they monitor them, they manage them. Now, as far as liability, if they're broken into, I think that's more of an insurance, cyber insurance question, which I'm not an expert, so I probably don't want to guess. But is that your industry, by the way, the liability piece? I'm curious. Sorry. You're supposed to be asking me questions, but I get to ask if
I'm
you.
just thinking from a risk management standpoint. I mean, I deal with banks, so banks are responsible, basically. They can outsource it, but they're still accountable and responsible for the oversight of its third parties. In this case, I'm viewing the charging stations as a third party. If I buy something from Walmart, I expect Walmart to stand behind it.
Right.
If my car, using that public EV charging station, subsequently has a problem because of a vulnerability being exploited, where's the throat to choke, so to speak?
Right. Yeah.
My first reaction is going to Walmart. They're the ones hosting this. If they're not overseeing their vendor properly, that's a problem.
Yeah.
And Walmart may have deeper pockets too than, Joe's.
Well, they have their forecourts where you can buy gasoline. So if your credit card gets stolen there, or there's probably they probably have thought that through, but there's probably a lot of attorneys behind that one. Thank you. Yeah.
So more toward maybe your company here on a supply chain, since you're the kind of the maintenance organization, does this open you up to a supply chain attack that if you're managing a EV charging system, possibly updating software in it or what have you as your new maintenance? Is that a concern for you? And what is your take on this supply chain issue as far as extending beyond a typical IT, OT type system into this type of new market?
Yeah, so definitely there's a supply chain issue, and we do have customers like Walmart and FedEx and PG&E in the Bay Area here is one of our customers. So they do annual security audits on their supply chain, and they're not for the lighthearted. I mean, we're not a big company, but it's still, we have to go through these huge cybersecurity supply chain audits every year. They take that serious, so do I. So we do everything we can for backups and reliability and cybersecurity. We run in Azure, so Microsoft does sort of help you out in the cloud infrastructure that you can use best practices and secure your SQL servers and your web gateways and all of that. But it's a lot of work. And as CTO, I also wear the CISO hat. So coming out of RSA this year, I'm going, okay, I better go back and make sure we have all our safeguards and best practices and all the developers are locked down. So anyway, it's a big concern. All right, if no more questions, then I appreciate everyone today, and please fill out a survey, and thank you for your attendance.